Hi everyone. Well, we've made it to block 5. We've made it to the last block of the semester. We've got 2 chapters left to go, and then you will finally have Bio 139 behind you. So, this first chapter of block 5 is going to be the urinary system, which is going to look at how our kidneys work. Now, there is a lot going on in this chapter. The first part of the chapter is just talking about anatomy and introducing some anatomical terms. That was what I break down as urinary system 1. There is a PowerPoint and an outline for that, but we do not devote lecture time to covering that. If you have questions, I'll still answer those if you reach out to me, but we are going to start with the physiology part. Now, before you watch this lecture or any of the upcoming lectures for this chapter, please make sure you have finished completely with the urinary part 1, the anatomy part, because I'm going to be discussing a lot of anatomical terms that it is expected you are already familiar with, and you get familiar with those by doing that first part of this chapter. Now, also at the end of this chapter, we are not going to cover any of that. What we are covering is how do the kidneys work. Once we get to the part that urine is formed and leaves the kidney to travel to the bladder, we leave off at that point. So anything that is not covered at the end of this chapter that you do not see covered in these lectures, you are not responsible for knowing. You are only responsible for what is in that self-study part, urinary system part 1, and the lectures that we have beginning here and continuing through most of the rest of chapter 25. So, as always, let's start with our not really attendance questions. First, what is the functional unit of the kidney? And second, how many of those units are there in each kidney? So go ahead and pause the video, try to answer those. Hopefully you've done that. Okay. Now, both of these should be pretty easy to answer based on that first self-study portion of the urinary system. So what is the functional unit of the kidney? That is the nephron. The nephron. And how many nephrons are there in each kidney? Approximately 1 million. They are very, very small. We do look at them in the lab portion of the course, so you will see them there, but we do need to know what a nephron is and the different parts of the nephron going forward. That was introduced already. We are going to talk about how the nephrons work. This is going to be a very, very brief lecture. Probably the shortest lecture of the entire semester, because really all we're doing is looking at the very, very broad overview of urine formation. We're learning some terms, we're looking at what a nephron looks like, and that's really it. We don't dive into the function until the next lecture. So, 4 terms that we are going to be using a lot. And you've heard these terms before, but you probably haven't used them correctly or even heard them used correctly. In this chapter, it is incredibly important that you use the correct term the correct way. Those terms are filtration, reabsorption, secretion, and excretion. Those are the 4 steps of urine formation: filtration, reabsorption, secretion, and excretion. Now, over here on the right, this is the very, very first part of a nephron. Really, some of this isn't even a part of the nephron. So this red vessel here, this is an artery that's bringing blood towards the nephron. Coming off of that artery is a small vessel called the afferent arteriole. Then Inside this little shell right here, we have a special capillary. This is called a glomerulus. And then exiting that capillary, normally this would be a venule. Remember, we go artery, capillary, venule. Well, here it's different. We have an afferent arteriole, a glomerulus, a type of capillary, and an efferent arteriole. There's an arteriole on each side of this specialized capillary. Now, this shell right here, if you did that self-study part, you know that this is called Bowman's capsule or glomerular capsule. Bowman's capsule or glomerular capsule. This tube coming down is the very first part of the nephron, but we're not even going to worry about what is this part of the nephron called. We are just going to say this is a tube. This is a tube because the rest of the nephron is just a long tube that does a bunch of different stuff. Different regions of that tube have different names. We're not there yet. All we are concerned with is knowing this is a tube and this is part of the nephron. Since these tubes are really, really small, they are microscopic, we don't just call them a tube, we call them a tubule. Tubule just means little tube. So this is a tubule. Now we have blood vessels carrying blood. We have this shell right here called Bowman's capsule or the glomerular capsule. We have this special capillary called the glomerulus, and we have this tubule. Once we know all of those things, we can start to talk about what these terms mean. First, filtration. Filtration is the process of moving most of the liquid part of blood from the glomerulus into Bowman's capsule. I'll say that again. Filtration is the process of moving most of the liquid part of blood from the glomerulus into Bowman's capsule. It only happens at Bowman's capsule. Filtration only happens at Bowman's capsule. I guess we could also say it happens at the glomerulus inside of Bowman's capsule. Now, plasma, the liquid part of blood, is filtered about 60 times per day. Think about that. Think how much blood is in your body. And remember, most of your blood, about 55% of it, is plasma. And that plasma, all of the plasma in your body, is filtered about 60 times per day. This is how we cleanse the blood. Well, when we remove that liquid part of the blood into Bowman's capsule, it is almost identical to plasma. It looks like plasma, but we call it filtrate because it is not exactly the same thing as plasma. It's almost the same thing, but it's not the same thing. Some stuff remains in the blood when we filter that plasma. So it's not identical. We give it the name filtrate. So let's put this all together. Filtration is the process of moving the liquid part of blood, or most of the liquid part of blood, from the glomerulus into Bowman's capsule, producing a liquid called filtrate. So Bowman's capsule is constantly being filled up with that liquid, with that filtrate, in the process known as filtration. Blood coming into the kidney, getting through smaller and smaller and smaller blood vessels until we get to the cortical radiate artery, which branches off into one of the many afferent arterioles, which then passes into the glomerulus. Here, it is under pressure, and liquid is coming out of the glomerulus. It is filling up Bowman's capsule. Now, Bowman's capsule is filled with filtrate. And that filtrate is now going to move through the rest of the nephron. As it moves through the rest of the nephron, some different processes are going to happen to it. And eventually, that filtrate is going to become urine. It's not urine yet. It's going to get there, but it's not there yet. So, filtrate is filling up Bowman's capsule. It leaves Bowman's capsule into one of the tubules. And inside the tubules, as we pass through the rest of the nephron, a couple of things happen. First, let's learn the next word, reabsorption. Reabsorption is the process of moving stuff from the filtrate inside a tubule back into the blood. Reabsorption is the process of moving stuff. We will get more specific later. It is the process of moving stuff from the filtrate inside of the tubule back into the blood. That happens all through the tubule. It happens different ways in different parts of the tubule, but it's still reabsorption. Now, reabsorption is going to reabsorb a lot of different things. But let's look at some of the things that it reabsorbs. 100% of the glucose that was previously filtered is reabsorbed. 100% of the amino acids that were previously filtered are reabsorbed. 100% of most vitamins that were previously filtered are reabsorbed. We need those. We need that glucose. We need those amino acids. We need those vitamins. So we don't want them to leave the body as urine. We want to hold on to them. So they're filtered. We can't help that. But our body reclaims them through reabsorption, moving them from the filtrate inside the tubule back into the blood. 99% of the water that is filtered is reabsorbed. We don't reabsorb all of it because urine is a liquid. We need something to help carry the other solids out of the body. But we want to keep as much water as possible. So almost every bit, 99% of the water that was filtered is reabsorbed. But there are some things that don't get filtered. Maybe they're too big. Maybe they have the wrong charge. Maybe there's too much of it. Whatever the reason, maybe some things did not get filtered, but we want them in the filtrate. Well, the next thing, secretion, is pretty much the opposite of reabsorption. Secretion is the process of moving substances from the blood into the filtrate at the tubules. Secretion is the process of moving substances from the blood into the filtrate at the tubules. And finally, as all of that liquid moves through those tubules, we're reabsorbing stuff, we're secreting stuff, we're changing that filtrate. By the time we get to the very, very end of the tubules, it's ready now to leave the kidney as urine. That urine leaves the kidney, travels through the ureter. I apologize. It leaves the kidney in the ureter, travels to the urinary bladder and it's held there until the urinary bladder gets full enough that you feel the urge to urinate or micturate. You travel to the bathroom and you release that urine. That process is excretion. Do not confuse excretion with secretion. Excretion is what happens at the toilet. This is when urine is leaving your body. That is excretion. So, here is how a book will depict a nephron. You've learned about a nephron already. We've learned here's the afferent and efferent arterioles. We can't really tell which is which here. Here is the glomerulus. Inside of here is Bowman's capsule. Bowman's capsule and glomerulus together, remember, is called a renal corpuscle. But as Bowman's capsule fills up with filtrate, that filtrate travels. Now we're going to see those terms that we learned before. The first part of the tubule is the proximal convoluted tubule, or the PCT. Now we have this U-shaped area called the loop of Henle, or the renal tubule. We have a descending limb of the loop of Henle and an ascending limb of the loop of Henle. Then we get to a distal convoluted tubule and a collecting duct. All through the PCT, the loop of Henle, the DCT, and the CD, the collecting duct, all through there, we are reabsorbing, we are secreting. And by the time we get to the end of the collecting duct, we have urine. That's eventually going to leave the kidney, and then eventually it's going to leave the body. So, this is a nephron. And like we said, don't worry about all of these other words around it right now. That's for much later. But right now, here is a nephron. And we said there are about 1 million of them in each kidney. Now, this is how your book draws a nephron. This is later in some later lectures. This is how I will draw a nephron. This is how I encourage you to draw a nephron. But this is not how a nephron looks. This is how a nephron looks. So you can see for obvious reasons why we draw it this way. Because even though you don't need to know them right now, we are going to be drawing things going in and coming out of the PCT, of the descending limb of the loop of Henle, of the ascending limb of the loop of Henle, of the DCT, of the collecting duct. Things are going to be going in and out. But this is not what it looks like. This is what it looks like. We draw it like this so that we can see each part and be able to distinguish it really, really easy. Later, we're going to see there's even another reason why it's important to draw it this way, but understand why it looks like this. That'll come in another lecture, maybe the next lecture. But here is what a nephron looks like. The yellow part are the tubules. The purple part are all the blood vessels that surround it. Same thing over here. These are two different types of nephrons. Some of them have a really short loop of Henle. Some of them have a really long loop of Henle. We'll get to the difference in those in one of our upcoming lectures. But just know that even though this is how I draw them, this is how your book draws them, in reality, they look more like this. So, last slide for this lecture is just talking about how much urine your body produces and how much liquid your kidneys filter and how much oxygen they need. Well, about 180 liters of filtrate are processed per day. That's about 47 gallons. 47 gallons of filtrate are processed per day. But of those 47 gallons of filtrate that are processed, less than 1% of that filtrate leaves the body as urine. Why? Well, because more than 99% of that filtrate is reabsorbed. It's stuff that our body wants to hold on to. But we still have to put it through that filtration process to remove the stuff that our body doesn't need. Our body's going to reclaim most of it because it does need it. But this is the way that our kidneys remove stuff from the blood so that we can get rid of it because we don't need it. The remainder, that 99+% that is not going to leave as urine, returns to the blood, returns to circulation. Now, the kidneys are constantly working. They need a lot of oxygen. 20 to 25% of the oxygen used by our body is used by our kidneys. There's a lot of activity going on in our kidneys to do all of this processing. Okay, so like I said, very short lecture today. We're just learning terms. In our next lecture, we will look at how filtration works. Later, we'll look at how reabsorption and secretion work. We'll look at how our body maximizes the amount of water that we reabsorb. So, make sure to go through that first part of urinary. Make sure that's locked in. Make sure you understand it completely. Make sure the terms that we introduced here are terms that you can use comfortably, use correctly. Once you are at that point, then we can move on to the next lecture. All right, take care, everybody, and I'll talk to you in the next lecture.